Hello, I'm Matt and welcome to Badge Workshop. So now we just need to get the motor put back in this thing. I don't know how the motor was mounted originally, but when I got this saw it was on a bit of old plywood, so I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. So I ripped down some ply that's going to fit on the brackets that are already there. I cut it into a couple of squares and then I can get these laminated together. One layer would have probably been enough, but the motor certainly has some weight to it, so I thought two would be better. I get them glued up, put together, get my bit of railway line on to weight them down and leave them to dry. When they're dry, I can get them put in the saw. Careful not to drop the saw down on my feet or hands, but I can lean it back up again, get a pencil and mark the holes from underneath. I've got some M8 bolts to bolt this down, so I'm drilling 8mm holes in the 4 holes I've marked. I can get the ply put back in the machine, and this time I'm just going to drop a bolt for each hole to line it up. I can now get the motor put in place. The motor has 2 pulleys on it, so I use a spirit level to help line it up to the other pulleys on the mechanism. When I have it where I want it, I mark out the 4 holes to attach the motor and I can get them drilled out. I decided it was going to be easier to attach the motor on the bench rather than trying to do it in the machine. So I got some bolts and washers put in from underneath. Then I could stand the motor up on its end and get it attached to the base. Now you can see I went back and added a couple of extra strips of wood to this ply because the motor needed to sit a little higher. With the bolts pushed through, I get some washers and nuts on and get everything tightened up. I can get the motor then put back into the machine. The bolts can be threaded back through the holes, then I can get washers and nuts on from the underside and get it all tightened up. When the blade rises and lowers, it needs to keep the belt tight. So this pulley is on an arm and it needs this spring reattaching that pulls it up, keeping the belt tight at all times. So with that on, I can look at fitting the belts. I've got a brand new linked V-belt. This is made of little links, so you can remove links or add them to get it the perfect length. When I got the saw, the belt was installed incorrectly and would only work when the blade was fully raised. So now I'm installing it, referring to a photo I have on my phone of how it should be done correctly. When I have it around all the pulleys, I can overlap the belt and then get a Sharpie to mark out where the links need to line up. I could then remove the links to make the belt the correct length. Shouldn't really need the pliers, but this was my first time doing it. The instructions then said to count the links and remove a link for every 24. So I did this and I had to remove 4 links. So I need 2 belts for this saw. So while I've got the first one at the correct length, or roughly the correct length, probably have to correct it later, I'm going to measure out the second one to get them the same. Because of that bracing bar in the centre of the saw, I've got to put the belt around the pulleys first before I can attach it back together. So I put it around the top pulleys and then I can put the belt back together. I can then get it pulled tight and put onto the motor pulley, onto the first one and then moving it on to the second one, the inner one. Then I can get the second belt on in exactly the same way. I thought they were a little loose and I went back and removed 2 more links. And the instructions say after running the saw for a while I might have to remove some more links. but so far it seems to be running pretty well, and it's certainly satisfying after you've taken everything apart and put it back together that it actually works. Always a bit nerve-wracking. This is the fence mechanism, and it's got some old paint on, so I'm going to paint on some paint stripper, leave that for half an hour, give it a good brush and a wash off. It seems to be about half paint and half rust, so when it's dried off I give it a coat of the rust converter. Unfortunately, the insert plate that came with the saw was broken, so I'm going to make a new one out of wood. The good thing about this saw not tilting is you never need to change insert plates. You can keep a zero clearance one in all the time. I get the wood planed down until it's fractionally thicker than the old insert plate. Then I can line it up with the throat and mark how long it needs to be. I get it cut to length using the miter saw. Then I can rip it to the correct width on the table saw. Again, cutting it slightly oversized so it won't actually fit in the gap. I can then use the hand plane to take a few shavings just to get a perfect fit. It's got slightly rounded corners, so I find a washer with the same profile and draw around that onto the wood. I can then use a random orbital sander just to sand down to those lines, rounding over the corners. The plate now fits in nicely, but I needed to hold it there so I can raise the blade. So I'm just going to put a couple of bits of wood, one at the front, one at the back, and get some clamps on to hold it in place. With the clamps tightened down, I can then turn the saw on and start raising the blade. I've done this a few times in the past, but I always find it nerve-wracking yet slightly satisfying. So this has cut a perfect slot for the blade, but it doesn't take into consideration the riving knife. So I mark out where the riving knife slot needs to stop. Then I can use a Japanese pull saw to finish the cut. There are tapped holes in the top to attach the plate down, but I want something a bit simpler. So I'm just going to drill out some little 10mm holes. I then can mix up a little batch of epoxy, dab some in the holes, and then I've got some little magnets, some rare earth ones to go in there. I get 2 installed at each end of the plate. Whilst I've got the drill out, I'm going to put another hole in, this time big enough to be able to get my finger in to pull the plate out. And with that done, I can get it installed. So the magnets stick down nicely. Then the plate can go in, needs a little tap down because it's a nice friction fit, and then you can get a finger in and pull it out. This is very slightly proud of the top, so I just take the random orbital sander and sand it flush. Modern saws have dust pulls. This is a dust chute, so I need a way of attaching a hose. I cut a bit of ply that's going to fit in the gap, and then use my bevel gauge to find the angle of the bottom of the chute. I can then set the miter saw to that angle and cut it on the bottom of the ply. I can then get the piece offered up into place and mark out how tall it needs to be. I can then take it back to the miter saw and get it cut to length. I'm just going to plug my vac that's on my cyclone into it. So I'm drilling out a 38mm hole at an angle. I can then get it installed. Just fits in with a friction fit and the hose slides in. Now this is only temporary because I just want some dust extraction, and I may come back later and add something bigger and better. I can now get this plate reattached to this inspection hatch. It was originally attached with some self-tapping screws that I had to grind off, so this time I've drilled some holes and I'm bolting it on. At the bottom it has a couple of little tabs that just hook over the dust chute, and at the top it's got a little knob with a turn on it. So I can get this reattached and then get it put on the saw. This just needs to be taken off every time you need to get to the arbor to change the blade. I got this riving knife made in part 2, but now I can finally get it installed. So it goes onto this little plate with a bolt, and then it can be put onto the lift mechanism. It just has a single nut to tighten it all up, and when I'm happy with the position of it, I can get the zero insert plate put back on. The saw came with this crown guard, so the top bit's made of aluminium and then it's got this bent steel bar. So first I'm going to tape this bar up so I can get this bit of aluminium primed and then a top coat in the same green as the rest of the saw. When the paint's all dry, I can take the masking tape off and then I use this rust converter to go over the steel bar. So when I got the saw, it had no switch on it at all. It used to just be plugged into a socket, which is dangerous in a few ways. It means you can't quickly and easily turn it off, and it's not an MVR switch like this one. What that means is, if I had a power cut and the saw was running and went off, then when the power came back on, the saw would just start automatically. With this switch, that won't happen. So I've run a new bit of cable from the motor into this switching box, and then I've got another cable that has a plug on the other end. This all gets put together with a few spade connectors, and then the front can get screwed in place. With the switch on, I can get the sides back on the machine. Now I can have a little test of the switch. So obviously green button starts it, red button stops it, emergency stop is the big mushroom button, and then to reset that you need to give it a twist. I also turned it off and on at the wall and it didn't come back on, so all's working as it should. So these are all the parts for the fence after they've been cleaned up. Now I just need to get it put back together. I've got some grease in between these parts and they slide to tilt the fence. They just get bolted together. And I'm going to do something about the handle for this in a bit. The fence itself gets attached to this mechanism with 3 bolts with Allen heads, so they just need tightening up. So the nut to release the tilt mechanism is just got a bolt in. The handle's actually missing. I'll show you one more thing that needs doing and then we'll get those fixed. So to get the fence on, this bolt slides into the T-track, then the fence goes over it, slotting into the track, and then the handle can go on and be tightened up. Undoing and tightening this nut might not be as quick as a cam lever on some fences, but it works really well and is very secure. So the fence also has this micro adjuster. To get it on the right way, that's it, slides into the slot and then has this little screw that goes onto this bolt. And this is how it was when I got it, but it doesn't do anything, it just flops down and it needs another bolt in there. So what I've got is a coach bolt that's going to fit through that hole and it needs to go into this track, but it doesn't quite fit. So I'm just going to file down the head so it's going to fit in that track. Now I'm going to get it slid into that track and mark out how long I want this bolt to be. Get a bit of Sharpie marked onto it and get it cut down to that length. Now these are bright, nice zinc plated bolts. So what I did is I took them into the kitchen and soaked them in citric acid to remove the zinc coating. Then I get some of this rust remover on that's going to blacken them up a bit. Whilst I waited for that to work, I thought I'd just add a little bit of detail, and that was pick out the name in some gold. Now I don't think this was original, but I did think it was a nice touch. Now that bolt has blackened up a little and get it into the slot and get the micro adjuster put on, I now got a star knob that's going to go on to lock it all in place. The wheel can then be put in and tightened up onto this threaded rod. So I think the micro adjuster is going to be pretty handy to have. You just tighten up this knob, loosen the fence off, and then you can just move this screw, adjusting the fence a very small amount. When you have it where you want it, you just tighten the fence back up. So the other thing I tried to blacken up a little was this bit of threaded rod, and I've got this new handle to go on it, and then this is going to go into the nut that adjusts the angle of the fence. So this saw has the fixed arbor, but you can tilt the fence. but the idea of making cuts along that scares me a little, so I don't think I'll be doing it. The back corner of the table has a hole in the top for the crown guard. The side has a hole in and is tapped for this bolt to go into, and that just tightens down to adjust the crown guard up and down. So the fence on this saw is quite short, it only goes halfway along the blade, and that's for safety reasons to stop kickback. I really don't like that style of fence, and looking at what other people have done, pretty much everyone has added a wooden sub-fence to it. So I'm just squaring up a bit of oak to do exactly the same thing. The fence already has 3 holes in it to allow you to do this, so I just get my bit of oak clamped in place, then I can drill through these holes from the back. Then I just drill down a short way, enlarging the top of these holes to accommodate some bolt heads. With that done, I got a coat of Danish oil on, allowed that to dry, then I could get it fitted. In the side with the enlarged holes, I get some bolts and some washers in. Then I get it lined up with the fence, these bolts pushed through the holes, and then on the other side I get another washer on, a nut, and get it all tightened up. So that is it all put back together. Now to make some test cuts. This is some 100mm thick oak beam. I've had it sitting around for a couple of years, so I'm making this cut in 2 passes. This is a combination blade, so I think with a rip blade you'd make it in 1 pass no problem whatsoever. So I'm pretty pleased with the performance. So that's it all finished. Thanks for watching, thanks to my Patreons, and please subscribe for more videos.